If you think you know what loyalty looks like, wait until you hear what this woman did. It started with a pot of soup and ended with a secret that shook a billionaire to his core. Nobody wanted to work for Arthur Mancini. 6 cooks in 18 months. Every one of them quit. But when a quiet woman named Pearl showed up at his gate with a dented pot and a handwritten recipe card, she did something nobody expected. She didn't just feed him. She unlocked a door he had sealed shut for 30 years. Hey there, welcome back. Before this story begins, do us a favor. Like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop your country in the comments below. Are you watching from Canada, Johannesburg, maybe Jamaica or Houston? We'd love to know. Now, let me tell you about Arthur Mancini. Arthur was 76 years old, and he lived alone in a house that had more rooms than most people could count. 22 rooms, to be exact. A stone house on a hill at the end of a private road lined with oak trees so old their branches touched over the top like fingers locking together. The driveway was long enough that you could lose your breath walking it. The front door was made of dark wood with an iron knocker shaped like a lion's head. But nobody ever knocked. Nobody was ever invited. Arthur was a tall man, even at 76. He stooped a little now, and his left knee gave him trouble when the weather turned cold. But you could still see the frame of the man he used to be. Broad shoulders, large hands with veins like rivers running across the backs of them. His hair was white, cut short, and always combed to the left. He wore the same kind of clothes every day. Dark trousers, a white shirt buttoned all the way up, and leather shoes that were polished every morning by a housekeeper named Mrs. Cho, who had worked for him for 14 years, and knew better than to speak unless spoken to. The house smelled like wood polish and old books. There was a library on the second floor with over 4,000 books on shelves that went from the floor to the ceiling. There was a piano in the sitting room that nobody played. There was a dining room with a table that could seat 16 people, but only one chair was ever pulled out, the one at the head, where Arthur sat alone every evening and ate whatever meal the current cook had left for him on a covered tray. Always at exactly 6:30. Arthur had made his money in shipping, container ships that carried goods across oceans. He started with one rusted vessel when he was 29 and built an empire that moved products for half the companies people bought from every day. He sold the business 15 years ago for a number so large it didn't feel like a real number anymore. Now he had nothing to do but sit in his 22-room house and count the silence. But what happened next changed everything. He had a son once. That is the part of this story that Arthur never talked about. His name was Daniel. Daniel Mancini. Born when Arthur was 32 and his wife Colette was 28. Colette was French. She had dark hair that fell past her shoulders and a laugh that sounded like music playing in another room. She used to cook. That is important. She cooked the way some people pray, with her whole heart and her eyes half closed, tasting everything with a wooden spoon, adding salt with her fingers, never measuring anything. The kitchen smelled like garlic and butter and rosemary when Colette was alive. The whole house did. You could smell it from the driveway. Colette died when Daniel was 14. Cancer. The fast kind. 6 months from the day the doctor sat them down to the day Arthur stood in a cemetery in a black suit holding a white rose he couldn't feel in his fingers. Daniel stood next to him. The boy didn't cry. Not that day. Not the day after. Not ever, as far as Arthur could see. And Arthur, who didn't know how to talk about feelings even before his wife died, did not ask. The years that followed were cold. Arthur worked. Daniel grew. They lived in the same house but moved through it like two ghosts who had forgotten they were haunting the same rooms. Daniel went to college. Arthur paid. Daniel graduated. Arthur sent a card. Daniel got married. Arthur came to the wedding but left before the reception. Daniel had a daughter. Arthur met her once, at a hospital, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in yellow while Daniel's wife, a woman named Grace, watched from the bed with careful eyes. Then there was the fight. The fight happened when Daniel was 38. It was about the business. Daniel wanted to be involved. Arthur said no. Daniel said he had earned a place at the table. Arthur said earning meant building something yourself, not waiting for someone to hand it to you. The words got louder, meaner. Arthur said things a father should never say to a son. He called Daniel soft. He called him unprepared. He said Colette had spoiled him. That was the sentence that ended it. Daniel looked at his father with eyes that had gone flat and still, like water before a storm, and said, "Don't ever say her name to me again." He walked out the front door. He didn't slam it. He just pulled it shut behind him with a click. That click was louder than any slam would have been. That was 24 years ago. Arthur had not spoken to his son since, did not know where he lived, did not know the name of his granddaughter, did not know if Daniel was even alive. He had hired a private investigator once, 5 years ago, but canceled the contract before any findings were delivered. He told himself he didn't want to know. The truth was, he was afraid of what he might find. Or worse, what he might not. And that was only the beginning. Now, the cooks. Arthur needed someone to cook his meals because he could not cook. Colette had done all the cooking, and after she died, Arthur never learned. He could not boil an egg without burning the pot. For years, he ate restaurant deliveries and prepared meals from services that sent plastic trays in insulated bags. But his doctor told him he needed proper food, home-cooked, less salt, less processed, more vegetables, more care. So Arthur hired a cook. The first one lasted 4 months. She said the kitchen was too cold and Arthur never said thank you. The second one lasted 3 months. He said Arthur threw a plate of fish against the wall because it didn't taste right. The third one made it 6 weeks. The fourth, 2 months. The fifth, 3 weeks. The sixth, 11 days. Each one left with the same look on their face, a mixture of exhaustion and relief, like someone who had finally climbed out of a deep hole. Mrs. Cho placed the 7th advertisement herself. She put it in the local paper, on a community board at the church, and at a culinary training center downtown. The ad said, "Private cook needed for elderly gentlemen. Live out position. Must prepare dinners 6 nights per week. Patience required." That last part, patience required, was Mrs. Cho's quiet way of saying what the ad couldn't. Now here is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. 3 people applied. 2 of them came for interviews, saw the house, met Arthur, and didn't come back. The third was Pearl. Pearl Okonkwo was 43 years old. She was a short woman, round in a way that made her look like she was built for hugging. She had dark brown skin, wide-set eyes, and a small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall. Her hands were rough, working hands. The kind of hands that had peeled 10,000 potatoes and kneaded 10,000 balls of dough and never once complained about it. She wore her hair in short twists, and she had a gap between her bottom teeth that showed when she laughed, which was often. Pearl had come to the country from Nigeria 21 years ago with 2 suitcases and an address written on a piece of paper. Her cousin's apartment in a city 300 miles away. She worked in restaurant kitchens for 15 years. Prep cook, line cook, pastry assistant, catering crew. She never had her own restaurant, though she dreamed of it. She had a binder, a thick, falling-apart binder with a cracked green cover, full of recipes she had written by hand on index cards and napkins in the backs of grocery receipts. Some were her mother's recipes, some were her grandmother's. Some were ones she had invented herself, late at night in small apartments, cooking for her daughter, Binta. Binta was 17 now, tall and serious, with glasses and a love for books that made Pearl say, "That girl reads like she's trying to finish the whole library before they close it." Binta wanted to be a doctor. Pearl wanted her to be whatever she wanted to be, as long as she was happy. They lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner. The apartment smelled like steam and pressing fluid during the day, but at night, when Pearl cooked, it smelled like home. Pearl showed up at the Mancini estate on a Tuesday morning carrying a dented aluminum pot and a recipe card. Mrs. Cho answered the gate intercom. Pearl said, "I'm here about the cooking job. I brought soup." Mrs. Cho buzzed her in. Pearl walked up that long driveway, looking at the oak trees with their locked fingers, carrying her pot with both hands. Mrs. Cho met her at the front door. She looked at the pot and said, "He doesn't do interviews over meals." Pearl said, "Then he can eat it after I leave. But food speaks better than words." Mrs. Cho almost smiled. Almost. She brought Pearl to the kitchen. It was the biggest kitchen Pearl had ever seen. Marble counters, a stove with 8 burners, a refrigerator that could hold a week's worth of food for 20 people. Copper pots hanging from a rack above the island. Everything polished, everything perfect. Everything unused. It looked like a kitchen in a museum, beautiful and completely dead. Pearl set her pot on the stove and turned on the burner. Mrs. Cho watched. The soup was a pepper soup, a Nigerian recipe Pearl's grandmother used to make. It had goat meat, Scotch bonnet peppers, utazi leaves, and a blend of spices Pearl kept in a small jar she carried in her bag. As the soup heated, the kitchen began to change. The smell came first, warm, deep, earthy, with a slow heat that tickled the back of your throat. Then the sound, a low, steady bubbling like the pot was whispering. Mrs. Cho stood very still. Her eyes were closed. Arthur appeared in the kitchen doorway. He hadn't been called. He had smelled the soup from the library upstairs. He stood there in his white shirt and dark trousers, his polished shoes on the tile, staring at the pot on the stove like he was looking at something that couldn't possibly be real. He said, "What is that?" Pearl turned around. She looked at this tall, stooped, white-haired man with the hard jaw and the empty eyes and said, "Pepper soup. My grandmother's recipe. Would you like some?" Arthur sat down at the kitchen table. Not the dining room, the kitchen table, a small one in the corner that Mrs. Cho used for her lunch. Pearl served him a bowl. He picked up the spoon. He tasted it. He didn't say anything for a long time. He took another spoonful, then another. Then he set the spoon down and looked at Pearl and said, "When can you start?" Pearl said, "Tomorrow." But what Pearl didn't know yet was that this kitchen held a secret that would unravel everything. Pearl started the next day. She arrived at 4 in the afternoon and began cooking by 4:30. She made jollof rice and fried plantain and a simple salad with tomatoes and cucumber. She left it on the dining room table, not on a covered tray, but on a real plate with a cloth napkin, and she put a small handwritten note beside it. It said, "Food is love made visible. Pearl." Arthur ate every bite. He didn't mention the note, but Mrs. Cho noticed he didn't throw it away. The second night, Pearl made roasted chicken with lemon and thyme, mashed potatoes with garlic, and steamed green beans. Another note. "A full belly makes a lighter heart." Arthur ate alone, as always, but Mrs. Cho said something shifted. He sat at the table longer than usual. He didn't get up the moment he finished. He just sat there, in the quiet, looking at the note. By the second week, Pearl had started arriving earlier. She would come at 3, sometimes 2:30. She cleaned the kitchen, really cleaned it. Not just polish and shine, but the kind of deep cleaning that meant she cared about the space. She rearranged the spice drawer. She hung a small towel with yellow sunflowers on it near the sink. Mrs. Cho didn't object. Arthur didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't say. But he noticed the food. Every night, something different. Nigerian dishes, French dishes, Southern American comfort food, Caribbean stews, Moroccan tagines. Pearl cooked from memory and from her binder and from a place inside her that couldn't be taught in any school. Every dish had a note, little messages in careful handwriting on folded pieces of paper. "You are not alone at this table. Someone thought about you today. Even a stone warms up if you hold it long enough." Arthur read every single one. He kept them in the drawer of his bedside table. Mrs. Cho knew this because she cleaned the room. She counted 12 notes in that drawer by the end of the 3rd week. Stay with us, because what happens next will shock you. One evening, Arthur came downstairs while Pearl was still cooking. This had never happened before. He always waited until she left. He stood in the doorway and watched her stir a pot of stew. She was humming. A low, steady tune with no particular melody, like a lullaby someone forgot the words to. Arthur's face did something strange. It tightened, then it broke, just for a second, and then it tightened again. He said, My wife used to hum when she cooked. Pearl turned around. She looked at him with those wide, steady eyes and said, "Was she a good cook?" Arthur said, "The best I ever knew." Pearl smiled. She said, "Then she put love into the food. That's the only ingredient that really matters." Arthur pulled out a chair and sat down. He watched Pearl cook for 45 minutes. He didn't say another word, but he was there. And Pearl let him be there without trying to fill the silence. After that night, Arthur started coming to the kitchen every evening. He would sit at the small corner table and watch Pearl cook, and sometimes they would talk, and sometimes they wouldn't. Pearl told him about Nigeria, about her mother who could cook a feast for 30 people out of almost nothing, about Binta and her dream of becoming a doctor, about the binder with the cracked green cover. Arthur listened. He nodded. Occasionally he asked a question, but he never talked about himself, never talked about Daniel, never mentioned a son at all. Pearl didn't push. She just cooked and left her notes and let the kitchen smell like something alive again. And just when you thought this was a simple story about a cook and an old man, everything changed. It was a Sunday, Pearl's day off. She had left a cold meal in the refrigerator for Arthur, a salad, cold roast beef, fruit, and a slice of cake she had baked the day before. She left her usual note. But that morning, before she left, she noticed something she hadn't noticed before. There was a door at the far end of the kitchen, behind the pantry. It was always closed. She had assumed it was a storage closet. But that morning, it was slightly open. Just a crack. Just enough to see that it wasn't a closet. Pearl pushed it open. Inside was a small room. Not a pantry. Not a storage room. A sitting room. There was a chair, a small table, and a shelf. On the shelf were photographs, dozens of them. A dark-haired woman holding a baby. A young boy blowing out candles on a birthday cake. A teenager in a graduation gown. A man and a woman and a child at a beach. And in the center of the shelf, a framed photograph of a young woman holding a wooden spoon, laughing in a kitchen, with flour on her cheek and love in her eyes. Colette. It had to be. Below the photographs, on the table, was a stack of letters. Unsealed. Unaddressed. Pearl picked up the top one. She knew she shouldn't read it, but the first line was visible without even opening it. It said, "Dear Daniel, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to tell you I was wrong." Pearl put the letter down. Her hand was shaking. She backed out of the room and closed the door. She stood in the kitchen for 5 minutes, her heart beating fast, her mind turning over and over like a wheel that wouldn't stop. That evening she went home and sat at her own small kitchen table with Binta. Binta was doing homework. Pearl watched her daughter's face, the concentration, the slight frown, the way she pushed her glasses up with one finger, and thought about Arthur alone in that big house with a room full of photographs and letters to a son who didn't know they existed. Pearl didn't say anything to Arthur about what she found. Not yet. She needed to be careful. Because some secrets are like old bones. You have to handle them gently, or they turn to dust. But the real shock was still coming. 2 weeks later, Pearl was at the grocery store buying ingredients for that night's dinner. She was in the spice aisle comparing 2 brands of cumin when she heard a voice behind her say, "Excuse me, do you know if they carry Scotch bonnet peppers here?" She turned around. A man was standing there. He was about 50, with brown hair going gray at the temples, tired eyes, and a jawline that made Pearl's breath catch because she had seen that exact jawline every evening for the past 2 months. On a 76-year-old face, in a kitchen with copper pots and an empty chair. She said, "They keep them in the back, near the international section." He thanked her and started to walk away. She said, "Excuse me, your name wouldn't happen to be Daniel, would it?" The man stopped. He turned around slowly. His face had changed. It was careful now, guarded. He said, "How do you know my name?" Pearl said, "I cook for your father." Daniel Mancini stood in the middle of that grocery store aisle and looked at Pearl like she had just told him the sky was green. He said, "My father doesn't have a cook. My father doesn't have anyone. My father made sure of that." Pearl said, "He has me. And he has a room behind the kitchen full of your pictures and letters he never sent you." Daniel leaned against the shelf. His hand knocked over a jar of paprika. It rolled across the floor, and neither one of them picked it up. He said, "Letters?" Pearl said, "A whole stack. I only saw the first line of the top one. It said, 'I was wrong.'" Daniel's eyes went red. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. He didn't cry, but he was close. Close enough that Pearl could see the muscles in his jaw fighting. He said, "I have a daughter. She's 24. Her name is Sophie. She's never met her grandfather." Pearl said, "I think that's something that should change." Daniel shook his head. He said, "You don't know him. He's hard. He doesn't bend." Pearl said, "He sits in my kitchen every night and watches me cook. He told me his wife used to hum. He keeps my little notes in his bedside drawer. That's not a man who doesn't bend. That's a man who bent so far he broke and has been holding the pieces together with silence." Daniel stared at her. He said, "Who are you?" Pearl said, "I'm just a cook, but I've learned that food opens doors that words can't. If you think you know what happened next, you don't." Pearl didn't tell Arthur about meeting Daniel, and she didn't tell Daniel to show up. What she did was much quieter than that, and much braver. The following Sunday, Pearl came to the house on her day off. She told Arthur she wanted to try a new recipe and needed the big kitchen. He said fine. He stayed upstairs. Pearl cooked all day. She made Colette's dish. She had spent the previous week looking through Colette's old recipe books, which were still on a shelf in the kitchen, dusty and untouched. She found a recipe for coq au vin written in Colette's handwriting. Small, slanted letters in blue ink. She followed it exactly. At 6 o'clock, the house smelled like France. Like butter and wine and thyme and something deeper. Memory, maybe. Arthur came downstairs. He walked into the kitchen and stopped. His nostrils flared. His hand went to the door frame. His legs locked. He said, "What did you make?" Pearl said, "Coq au vin, from your wife's recipe. I hope you don't mind." Arthur didn't answer. He walked to the table. Pearl had said it differently tonight. 2 places, not 1. Arthur looked at the second setting. He looked at Pearl. She said, "Sit down, please." He sat. Pearl sat across from him. They ate together. Arthur didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. Then he said, in a voice Pearl had never heard from him before, thin, fragile, like glass about to crack, "She used to make this on Sundays. Daniel loved it. He would eat 3 plates. Pearl set down her fork. She said, "Tell me about Daniel." Arthur looked at his plate. He said, "I lost him." Pearl said, "Lost him or pushed him away?" Arthur's hand trembled. He put down his fork. He said, "Both. I said things I can never take back. I said Colette had spoiled him. I used her name like a weapon. Against my own son." Pearl reached across the table and put her hand on his. Her rough hand on his old hand. She said, "Have you ever told him that?" Arthur said, "I've written it down. Dozens of times. But I never sent the letters. I don't even know where he lives." Pearl was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if he was closer than you think?" Arthur looked at her. His eyes were wet. She had never seen that before. Not once in 2 months. He said, "What do you mean?" Pearl said, "I met a man at the grocery store last week. He had your jawline and your wife's eyes. He asked about Scotch bonnet peppers." Arthur went completely still. His breathing stopped for a second. Then it came back, shallow and fast. Pearl said, "He knows about the letters, Arthur. I told him. And he cried in the middle of the spice aisle." Arthur put both hands flat on the table. He closed his eyes. A tear ran down the left side of his face, into the lines, disappearing into his white collar. He whispered, "Is he okay?" Pearl said, "He has a daughter named Sophie. She's 24, and she's never met her grandfather." Arthur made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The kind of sound that comes from a place inside you that language hasn't reached yet. Pearl stood up. She walked to the counter and picked up a piece of paper she had placed there earlier. A phone number. Daniel's phone number. She set it on the table next to Arthur's plate, right beside Colette's coq au vin. She said, "I'm just a cook, Arthur. I make food and I leave little notes. But this is the most important note I'll ever leave you. That number is your son. What you do with it is up to you." Then she picked up her bag, squeezed his shoulder, and walked out the front door. She walked down the long driveway under the oak trees with their locked fingers and got into her old car and sat there for 5 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, crying so hard her chest hurt. Arthur sat at that kitchen table for 2 hours. Mrs. Cho came in once, saw his face, and left without a word. At 8:47 that night, Arthur picked up his phone and dialed the number. It rang 4 times. Daniel answered. He said, "Hello?" Arthur opened his mouth. Nothing came out. 24 years of silence had rusted his voice shut. Daniel said, "Hello? Who is this?" Arthur took a breath. He said, "It's your father. And I was wrong. About everything." Daniel was quiet for so long that Arthur thought the line had gone dead. Then he heard it. A sharp, broken breath. The sound of a grown man trying not to cry and failing. Daniel said, "Dad?" Arthur said, "I'm here, son. I should have been here a long time ago. But I'm here now." They talked for 3 hours. Arthur told Daniel about the letters. Daniel told Arthur about Sophie, about Grace, who had passed away 4 years ago from the same thing that took Colette, about raising a daughter alone and being so angry at Arthur for not being there that the anger had become a wall he couldn't see over anymore. Arthur said, "I kept her kitchen the same. The recipe books are still on the shelf. Pearl found them." Daniel said, "Pearl, the cook." Arthur said, "She's more than a cook. She's the first person who made this house smell like home in 30 years. 2 weeks later, Daniel drove up the long driveway. He brought Sophie. Sophie was 24, with dark hair like Colette and Arthur's broad shoulders and Daniel's tired eyes. She walked into the house she had never seen and looked around at the 22 rooms and the piano nobody played, and the library with 4,000 books, and she said, "Grandpa, this house needs more people in it." Arthur looked at this young woman who carried pieces of everyone he had ever loved inside her face, and he said, "You're right. It does." Pearl cooked dinner that night. She made the coq au vin and the pepper soup and jollof rice and plantains and a chocolate cake that Binta helped her bake. She set the table for 6. Arthur, Daniel, Sophie, Pearl, Binta, and Mrs. Cho, who protested but sat down anyway. 6 people around a table built for 16. The kitchen smelled like garlic and butter and Scotch bonnet peppers and chocolate and every kind of love there is. Binta and Sophie sat next to each other and talked about school and books and what it was like to grow up with one parent doing the work of 2. Sophie looked at Binta and said, "Your mom is amazing." Binta pushed her glasses up and said, "I know. She leaves little notes in my lunch. Every single day. Even now, even though I'm 17 and I pretend it's embarrassing." She paused. Then she smiled and said, "I keep every one." Arthur heard that. He looked at Pearl. Pearl looked back at him. No words. Just a look. The kind of look that says, "You see? That's all it ever takes. Just a small note that says someone thought of you." After dinner, Sophie found the room behind the kitchen. She stood in front of the photographs and touched the one of Colette with the wooden spoon and the flower on her cheek. She said, "She's beautiful, Grandpa." Arthur stood behind her. He said, "She would have loved you so much." Sophie turned around and hugged him. He held her carefully at first, like he had forgotten how, and then tighter, like he was remembering. The following month, Arthur made 2 decisions. The first was that he would pay for Binta's medical school. All of it. He told Pearl over dinner, matter-of-factly, the way he used to announce business decisions. Pearl stared at him. She said, "Arthur, I can't accept that." He said, "You left a note on my table once that said food is love made visible. This is the same thing, just with a bigger plate." The second decision was that he would turn 3 rooms of the house into a small cooking school. Pearl would run it. Free classes for young people who wanted to learn to cook. He said, "This house has been quiet for too long. Your grandmother's recipes deserve a bigger kitchen than my life gave them." Pearl sat at the table and cried into her hands. Binta put her arm around her mother and said quietly, so only Pearl could hear, "You changed his life with a pot of soup, Mom. That's not cooking. That's a miracle." Pearl laughed through her tears. She wiped her face with the sunflower towel and said, "It's not a miracle, baby. It's just what happens when you show up and you don't give up." On the day the cooking school opened, Pearl left one more note on the kitchen table. But this time, it wasn't just for Arthur. It was for everyone. It was pinned to the wall by the door where every student would see it when they walked in. It said, "A meal shared is a bridge built. You don't need a big kitchen. You just need a full heart." Arthur read it. He stood in front of it for a long time. Then he turned to Pearl and said something he hadn't said to another person in decades. He said, "Thank you. For the soup. For the notes. For not giving up on a stubborn old man who had forgotten how to let people in." Pearl handed him an apron. She said, "Put this on. Class starts in 10 minutes, and you're chopping the onions." Arthur took the apron. He put it on. He picked up a knife. And for the first time in 30 years, Arthur Mancini stood in a kitchen that smelled like love and felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Sophie walked in the door just before class started, holding a frame. Inside the frame was Colette's recipe card for coq au vin, the one with the small slanted letters in blue ink. She hung it on the wall next to Pearl's note. 2 women who never met. 2 kitchens on different sides of the world. One truth they both understood. Food is how you say what your mouth can't. And that's the end of today's story, but the lessons last forever. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't, and tell us in the comments, which character reminded you of someone in your own life? See you soon.